Hey girls, Tiffany Dawn here, and I'm sitting here in the baby's nursery with the polka dot wall that I just made out of little vinyl polka dots that I love. You can follow my Instagram if you want to, at Tiffany Dawn IQB, and I'm posting like updates on there, like nursery pictures and stuff on my story regularly. But I want to talk today about times of suffering and pain. So if you're going through a really tough time, I'm hoping that this video can encourage you so much. So I was reading through your comments, your God stories on our giveaway video the other week, and I'm just blown away by some of the stories you guys are sharing and some of the insights. And I just want to read you what Kayla Vizo said at the end of her story. She said, "I tell people it was the hardest thing I've ever gone through, but it was also the best thing that ever happened. I took away so much and I learned a deeper level of intimacy with God. Suffering does that. It's not going to last forever, although it may feel like it. I'm thankful God didn't immediately heal me, but it walked with me instead." This is something that I've been learning the past few months as well, or the past year really. Almost a year ago, we had a miscarriage with our first child. Some of you have seen that video about our miscarriage story, and if you haven't, I've linked it down in the description below. And that was just like this deep pain. Like, even though we'd only been pregnant a short time, it was like I'd fallen in love with that baby, and it was just this deep, deep pain. And through it all, I just felt like God was so close to us. Like, he was walking with us hand in hand through that pain. He was using that pain, that sorrow, that grief, that suffering to teach us something and to turn it into something beautiful. And so I want to share with you 3 thoughts that have been forming in my mind since then about suffering. And I'm just hoping that they can encourage you if you're in a season where you're feeling like a lot of pain and a lot of grief. So thought number 1 is that suffering can be our greatest teacher if we'll let it. I want to read you something I wrote in my journal a couple months after losing Tiny, our first baby. Here's what I wrote. "Suffering is a catalyst. I've heard and read Christians who've said God hates sickness and suffering and doesn't promote it. But I think we miss something huge when we believe that. We miss the power of Christ in us, and that comes when we suffer with him. I've spent my life so afraid of suffering, trying to avoid it at all costs, only to discover that it can be beautiful." I keep thinking of the story of Hinds Feet in High Places, which is this beautiful allegory book. And in it, there's this girl whose name is Much Afraid, and she has 2 companions on her journey up the mountain to come closer to God. And their 2 companions are sorrow and suffering. But when they get to the top of the mountain, they're revealed for who they really are, which is grace and glory. Suffering is a catalyst. God sometimes allows it in love, because if we will let it, it will become our greatest teacher. Pain can move us to the greatest healing, a healing far deeper than our bodies. It can bring us so much closer to God, and I think that's what he wants more than anything. And that's what I've discovered, a deeper fellowship with God that has come not in spite of, but because of my suffering recently, and I am so grateful for it. Just through that miscarriage, just how much closer I was able to come to God, just how much more human I became through the grief. It was so hard, and there's still days when it's really painful. One of my friends and I got pregnant at the same time, and were due around the same time. And when she had her baby a couple months ago, I just sat on my kitchen floor and like bawled my eyes out. And there's still days, I could just cry over it, but it has become a teacher, and it's become a gift, and it's become beautiful. And so I think just look at suffering as a teacher. Look at it as something that God can use in your life, that it's not wasted. Now, thought number 2 that has to come right on the heels of that is, I don't believe that every kind of suffering is like ordained by God. Obviously, God allows things that happen in our lives, but I think there are some kinds of suffering that are just a result of living in a fallen and broken world. Like you hear in the Bible, for example, the story of Lazarus in John 11, and one of Jesus's good friends, Lazarus, got really sick, and they sent for Jesus and were like, "Jesus, could you come heal him?" And it says because Jesus loved them, he didn't come right away. Instead, he said, "This is for the glory of God." It's being allowed that God would be glorified. And Lazarus ended up dying, and then 4 days later, Jesus came, and everyone's weeping and grieving and mourning, and he's like, guys, like, watch what I'm gonna do. And he raises him from the dead. So like, that's the kind of suffering that I think of when I'm like, this is allowed, like ordained by God, like this is for his glory. He's specifically like allowing this for his glory. But I do think there's other kinds of suffering in this world that are simply a result of a fallen and broken world. Like, God has given us free choice. He doesn't force us to love him. He doesn't force us to love others, and we'd be robots. And so there's so much brokenness. There's so many people who choose, instead of love, they choose to hurt, they choose to hate, they choose to abuse. So things like human trafficking or abuse or rape or abandonment, like when those things happen, like I do not for 1 second believe that was God's heart for his children at all. I think that's a result of living in this world that's broken. So I don't think that all forms of suffering are like John 11 with Lazarus, where it's ordained by God for his glory. However, I do with all my heart believe that God can transform every kind of suffering and pain into something beautiful. I believe with all my heart he can redeem all suffering and pain, that there's not a single wasted tear, there's not a single wasted moment of suffering, that God can and will take it all and redeem it for his amazing glory and purposes if we will let him. And so I don't want you to go away from this video thinking, man, these horrible things happened to me in childhood. I was abused. And Tiffany's saying that that was from God. I'm not saying that at all. What I am saying is he can take those horrible things that you went through and he can turn them around. He can heal your heart and he can turn them into this story that can encourage other people. The Bible says, comfort others with the comfort that you've received. And it reminds me of like recycling, like how God uses our pain to comfort others. He is the world's greatest recycler. And that brings me to point number 3, which is suffering can either trap us or it can become our ministry and it can become our story. So for example, one of the really hard times in my life was after I broke up with my first boyfriend, and it was a really bad relationship, really damaging. And I came out of that struggling with an eating disorder and I just working through several years of like deep sadness. During that time and that pain, I felt like God not only pulled me so much closer to him, which I think is his primary goal in all of life, but I also found that he took all of those things I'd been through and I could have let them trap me in bitterness, or I had the option to give it to God and see what he would do with it. And he created this ministry that I do today from that season of pain. And I think so many times we allow our past brokenness and suffering to entrap us and enslave us to bitterness and hate and unforgiveness. But if we will give it to God, and that will take time, it will be a slow process of giving it and re-giving it and slowly healing and going to therapy sometimes. But as we give that to God, I've seen him in so many lives use exactly that suffering to create a new ministry and to encourage so many other people. And like, you have no idea what God can do with your suffering, with your past, and with your story. And I think for some of us in the midst of suffering, all we want to know is like, God, do you see me? Your God sees you. Like, he sees the sparrows, the little average bird that are everywhere flitting around. And how much more does he see you as his daughter, as his child? Like, right in the midst of your pain, in the midst of your brokenness, he's not forgotten you. He's not left you. You might not feel him right now, but one day I believe you'll look back and you'll see he was right next to you every step of the way. So I love you, girls, and I'll see you next Tuesday. Bye.